both great knowledge and compassion, and that has been affirmed by my getting to know him better since then. And he's going to be talking on possession, attachments, or soul fragments. Now, I know that David, from earlier discussions we've been having in the SRF, is very interested in this whole aspect of soul integration. We can address the problem of spirit attachment in its own right. But of course, there is always that enormous question, what is it that renders some people vulnerable? What is the problem of the soul or the self that makes them vulnerable to other energies and entities? So I'm hoping, I don't know, but I'm hoping that this is something that David will be touching on. The other thing to mention is that David takes people on very interesting tours abroad, including Egypt, and is going to Egypt this November, to the Sinai and to the pyramids. And it's rumored that if you want to have spontaneous past life experiences, just go with David and it'll happen out there. David's been involved with spirit release work for more than 35 years, and he's the author of 5 books, including Working with Earth Energies and Healing Your Family Patterns. I think both books are out there to look at and buy on our stand. And as I mentioned earlier, he's our current chair of the Education Committee. So thank you, David. Lovely to have you with us, and thank you very much. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Can you all hear me at the back? Great, okay. I thought I'd give a contemporary theme to this talk. So as you can see, we've got a bit of the Da Vinci Code in here. Or maybe it's the Divine Feminine making yourself felt, or maybe even Mummy, but whatever. It seemed to be appropriate. As Andrew said, the title of this talk is Possessions, Attachments, or Soul Fragments. And I want to look at, perhaps slightly pretentiously, at some new paradigms in spirit release, because this is an area which has interested me and fascinated me for many years. And this is me. So perhaps just to say a little bit about my background as to why I feel I could make some comments about all of this. First of all, I was very fortunate in being able to grow up in a family which believed in spiritual healing. So I was sort of imbued with it from a very young age and experienced and witnessed some amazing things. And also, I had quite a lot of psychic experiences from a child and have continued to do so. I am aware sometimes when spirits are around, perhaps not every time, but a lot of times when I allow my psyche to be in touch at that side. And lastly, I've worked as a healer for more than 39 years. And in that work, I've been very interested in what is going on within an individual that causes some form of problem to manifest for them, whether it's a physical problem, emotional problem, psychological or spiritual. And indeed, from that, you start to work out to recognize there's energies in places which can affect people, and all sorts of other levels to do with the ancestors and so forth. So, spirit release. Well, I think it falls into 2 very neat categories. One is where you get spirit release within places. And in this situation, it's fairly easy to comprehend what is going on. A spirit, perhaps you sense the spirit is stuck in a room. You can connect with the spirit. You can do work to help release the spirit. And in my experience, these are, on the whole, do not cause very many problems. Occasionally they can do, and I will share some experiences on this, but in most cases it's fairly simple to work with and understand. However, when we come to look at spirit release in people, then we start to tap into some situations which are quite complex, or indeed very complex in my experience. And they can also be quite difficult to deal with. And one of the things I want to do in this talk is to begin to explore some of these aspects. I'm first of all going to touch into spirit release in places, because I think it's important we start there, and then come on to look at spirit release in people, what might be going on there, and then to start to look at how we can begin to model what might be taking place. And as we go through this presentation, I hope you'll get a sense of what that might be. And finally, to suggest some new approaches to spirit release within the healing of the psyche. So let's start off with spirit release in places. Well, we've got to put a bit of humor in here, haven't we? Sometimes referred to as ghost busting, but I can assure you, in my experiences, it's been nothing quite like the film. I can't think I've ever been slimed as such. But sometimes one might need to deal with some quite difficult type of cases. Also, when we're looking at these types of situations, broadly speaking, we're dealing with Homo sapiens spirits, but again, as we go through, I'll touch into one or two cases where we were dealing with other life forms, because we need to recognize spiritual life is around us all the time. In fact, within our physical bodies at this moment in time, you are full of microbes, which are, in a way, spiritual essences within you. We don't normally think about those as being having problems. Now, as Peter so beautifully talked about, the near-death experience gives us a wonderful insight into what actually should be taking place in the death process. But for different reasons, spirits can become stuck. And in this, we sometimes refer to them as being earthbound. So, if we're going to have one of Peter's good transitions, here we can see, as you can see, I like Egypt, but here we can see the individual passes over, and they need to make a transition through into the spirit realm. The soul leaves the physical body and then passes through sometimes what's referred to as a tunnel of light to actually get there. But again, for different reasons, sometimes souls can get stuck. So what causes some of this? It generally falls into a few basic categories of problems which will cause a soul to become earthbound or stuck here in the physical. And one of the biggest of these, perhaps, is fear. There's been quite a number of times when I've been involved in trying to do some work to help release a soul or spirit, only to find when I start to communicate with this, because we can learn to communicate with these spirits, to say they're terrified of going to hell. You know, they've done some frightful deed in their lifetime, and then they feel, because of the way in which religion has imposed its views upon them, that if for what they've done, they're going to go to hell. And the last thing they want to do is to leave the place from where they are. So those souls need to be coaxed and talked to and communicated. And all of this takes place at a telepathic level. So I'm not actually speaking, but I'm communicating with them and assuring them that everything is going to be fine to help actually release them. But fear can become a very powerful force in all of this. Beliefs. Another one, no belief in an afterlife. Well, Peter was saying how important it is that we prepare for our death, a real sense of belief that we are actually going to be moving on somewhere else. But again, there's times when in tuning into a place or property, you find that some soul or spirit lying comatose, fast asleep, without any sense of a recognition that they need to move on. And in those cases, again, you need to connect with them and try and wake them up to help them in their journey. Another one is not realizing they're dead. And very strange. Again, I can think of just one story which comes to mind, going back quite a number of years now, when I was living in my probably late 20s, I guess, living in Cheltenham, and I was living in a row of houses which probably dated to about 1890. And we got to know a young couple who lived a few doors down the road from us. And one day, going over there for a cup of coffee, we sat down in the room, they were talking to me and sharing all of the problems which had been going on in their house. You know, they'd started to do some alterations, and this had gone wrong, that had gone wrong, and they couldn't work out, they were feeling disturbed in some ways. And I suddenly became incredibly conscious of a man dressed in there. I could still see him. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he was in braces, probably dated from about 1910 or that sort of time. And he was furious. Who was in his house? Who was messing about with all of the things which were going on there? And he was absolutely angry at all of this. So, you know, there's me in a conversation with this couple, also conscious of this other dynamic going on. I thought, well, how on earth do I deal with this? But I was able to sort of just say to them, because they were sort of interested in these areas, look, I think there's a spirit here. There's something which needs work sorting out. Just give me 5 minutes, I'll close my eyes, I'll connect to it, sort it all out, and then everything will be fine, which is what I did. Communicated with him, said to him, look, you know, maybe you've been here a long time, trying to connect with his relatives to bring them present, and next minute, he'd gone, quite happy. So I came around and said, well, that's all done. And the man who was sat next to me had gone as white as a sheet. He said, as soon as I started, he felt the room go freezing cold. I didn't experience this, but that's what he experienced. And he didn't know whether to shout, scream, run out of the room, or do what. So that taught me a little bit of a lesson about approaching all of these things. We need to be sometimes a little bit conscious when we're doing this sort of work, that the people we're doing it for, if you like, in their house, can be aware of it. Needless to say, since that was done, there was no more problems in the property, everything sort of was fine. So, again, sometimes we can get souls stuck for that reason. This is another interesting case, resurrection of the body. I don't know if any of you have been up to Edinburgh, but I was up there a few years ago, and having a chance to walk around some of the graveyards there, because suddenly became aware of all of these spirits. What on earth were they doing? And what I came to recognize was that, in fact, they were waiting for the resurrection of the body. You know, my body's got to be resurrected, so I've got to hang around with the body. But also, at the time, they were very conscious that there were body snatchers, because this was a time when body snatching was going on. So they were riddled with fear. So we had the fear going on as well. Obviously, in these cases, you know, it was not appropriate to try to deal with all of them together. So over a period of time, connecting with different people, we've done work to try to help release some of those. And generally, when you set something in motion, others start to follow. Another one could be revenge. You get ancestral spirits, I think can sometimes come through to cause problems. Accidents is another. Confusion. One of the things we need to recognize in some ways is that sudden death nowadays is actually much more common than it was before. Normally when you were going into battle, you were sort of preparing yourself. Could be fighting. Or if you became ill, there was a good chance that you were going to die. In today's world, you can be driving a car and you can have an accident and you're killed instantaneously. And even more horrifically, sometimes people are blown up suddenly. And of course, when that happens, there's an incredible amount of confusion within the spirit, and so they do need help to move over. We shouldn't forget ritual slaying, human sacrifice. For all of you who think the Celts were a great race, I can assure you that they had some practices which were not so good, because I've had to release some spirits which were caught up in being sacrificed in Celtic times, going back into Celtic times. And we shouldn't forget capital punishment. I've not necessarily had to do any spirits on that level, but I'm sure there are some which get stuck because of that. We shouldn't forget murder and suicides. One of the difficulties with suicides, again, what I would like to emphasize from my experience, sometimes souls, through the state of their consciousness or thought, will become held in a certain way. Now, suicide at one level thinks that this is the end, this is the extermination of where they're going to. But once they come out of their body, they can sometimes find that that's not the end. And yet they still haven't made the full transition. And in those cases, there's a number of people I had to deal with who felt a friend who committed suicide has latched onto them and is like trotting along beside them. So one needs help to give them to help release that type of situation. And I thought I'd just finish on this dealing with individuals to pick up one particular famous spirit which had got stuck, Tutankhamun. I first went to Egypt back in the late 80s. And one of the interesting things is in going into his tomb, and it wasn't just me who experienced this, suddenly being aware that there was the spirit of Tutankhamun was still there in the tomb. But that spirit also carried an incredible amount of anguish and anger within it. And at the time, we got some guidance, as we do from higher levels. And what we were told was we had to proceed with an extreme caution in dealing with releasing the spirit of Tutankhamun, because people had tried before and all they had was a very bad kickback. Now, one of the principles which happens in life is if two forces meet, the stronger will always come out on top. So if I was to step into a boxing ring with Mike Tyson or some other guy like that, I really wouldn't stand much chance at all. And the same applies when dealing with things at a spiritual level. So this is where sometimes dealing with more difficult cases, it's much better to work within groups. So what we did was we gave a lot of healing to the spirit of Tutankhamun over several years, recognizing that in the core of everyone, every spirit, there is a divine part, and you can connect through to that divine part. And then we called on the help of his wife, Ankhesenem Amun, and here we see them together, here. And that started the process. In fact, what triggered it off finally was the Luxor massacre, because very close by in Egypt, in the Valley of the Kings, there was this terrible massacre which took place in the 90s. And at some level, when you get a spirit in a real disturbed space, it can affect quite a large area. And finally, we linked to his uncle or father, King Akhenaten. And that.
What do you mean by healing? What kind of healing did you
It's when I talk about healing, it's like connecting into spiritual energy, God's energy, and channeling it through me to help direct it to the soul or spirit. Feeling of balance. So let's just look quickly at the process of release in this case, and this applies to both places and within people. First of all, I think it's very important to put up your protections. So here we are, we've got a nice protection around ourselves. And also, in these sorts of cases, I'd always encourage people to work together with more than just themselves. And you can have some people specifically putting up protections. Then we need to telepathically connect to the spirit. So here we are, we've got our spirit, and as you can see, it's already surrendered. And you try to give a sense of healing and balance and a feeling of that where they're going to is going to be fine. And sometimes there's fear involved in all of this. Peter talked about the tunnel. So what we need to do is open up a sense of a link or tunnel connection to the other realm. And to help me do this, I always called upon the help of one of my guides, helpers. In ancient Egypt, it was Anubis. He was the god who took the souls into the other realm. If you're coming out of more of a Christian perspective, you can call upon St. Michael, and finally you can release the spirit. It's great, isn't it, these graphics? And when you've done all of that, finally you can bring yourself back to take down any of the protections, and 90% of the cases which I deal with at that level, they're very simple to deal with, not a lot of problems. Just occasionally, we do get some difficulties occurring. But now we come to look at spirit release within people. These situations, in my experience, are far more complex. We might say at the simplest level, you just have to remove a spirit, sense the spirit is there present, and then to help it move on. But the very first thing that I want to do is to discover why the spirit is there. Because it's just possible the spirit could have come to help. Indeed, there's a wonderful book which I would recommend all of you to read on this sort of subject called Journey of Souls by Dr. Michael Newton. It talks about this whole process in a lot of depth. And one of the things that Michael Newton says, in all his experience, he's felt very little trauma has come through. In other words, negative spirit influences coming onto someone. And in his experience, most of the times when people felt there was some problem, it was to do with the spirit which has come to help. And I'll give you another little example in all of this. Going back quite a number of years ago, there was a whole group of us. We went away on holiday together. In fact, I think even there's someone in the audience here, is David, remembers that time in Cornwall. And we'd all come from different areas, so we didn't all know each other, but there was one person in the group who was suffering some bad headaches. So she asked myself and my wife for some healing. Tuning into her, I sensed there was an elemental spirit with her. And what do I mean by an elemental spirit? A spirit connected with one of the elemental forces which holds life together, because I believe spiritual life works through everything. So we've got the spirits which connect into fire, air, water, and earth. And there was this elemental spirit there. Obvious reason why there was a cause of headache. And the sort of immediate response would think, what's an elemental spirit doing there? Let's get rid of it. But I communicated with that elemental spirit, and it said to me that it had been come to help her with writing. It was going to help her with learning to write and to produce something which was important. And one of the reasons why she was getting the headaches is because it had been trying to communicate with her, get through, and she had been resisting all of this. So, I gave her some healing, told her about all of this, and didn't think anything more of it until probably 15 years later, when I bumped into this woman again, and she said, "Oh, do you remember this story?" Well, of course, these stories you tend to forget. And I said, yes. She said, well, the amazing thing was, she said, at the end of that fortnight when we were together, I sat down and wrote my first poem, and since then I've gone on to have 6 books published. So I thought there was it's something that is very important to try to understand. If you sense there's a spirit there, why is it there? What is it doing? What's it come to do? And a couple of other cases of situations which appeared to be spirit attachments, which in fact were not. And the first of these was a woman who came to see me feeling that she was possessed by some very nasty force or energy, which she described as like a man dressed in black clothes. So we get into a sort of counseling situation. I sort of try to connect with her, find out what's going on for her as she described all of this. And in tuning into her, I must admit, I couldn't sense any spirit being present. Now, I was coming from a viewpoint which said spirits do latch onto us, they cause problems. So just to be sure, I thought I'd go through my little rituals of healing and balance, clear her all out, make sure energy, aura was clear. And if there was a spirit there, try to send it on its way. Did that produce any effect? No, still there. Can still feel this terrible energy, you know. So I said, well, okay, describe what you sense with it. What are you feeling? What do you experience? She said, I can see a man. It's there. He's standing next to me. He's got a knife. It's as though he's trying to stab me. He's trying to murder me. And at those cases, those situations, you sort of almost put out a cry of help to the cosmos. You know, How am I going to deal with this? What's going on? And a little voice said to me, ask her who she's trying to murder. So I did, in a very clear, direct way. Who are you trying to murder? And it pulled her up short, and then she let out an incredibly deep, anguished wail as she went into a whole cathartic experience. And the upshot of it was that she had, her husband had left her, and all of the murderous rage she was feeling inside her was so overwhelming, she had split it off. And the process of healing was reintegrating that energy. And I want to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And another quick case of someone, again, who came to see me, and this time for healing, and she mentioned in this case, she felt she was pregnant. And I could see a spirit stood next to her. Oh, that's fine. I'm sure there's a spirit there. I can see it, and so forth, and it feels all okay. But she, was the time, needed to go and get a checkup with the doctor, and she went down to the doctor's, got a checkup, came back negative. She wasn't, her periods had stopped. She'd had a number of problems. There was nothing, she wasn't pregnant. So we came back and we thought, well, I better find out about what's going on with this spirit. And in tuning into the spirit, sometimes you will find spirits will mask themselves. So I had to challenge the spirit. And when I really challenged the spirit, what appeared there underneath was something very nasty. So sometimes we talk about dark force entities or things which are not right. And work had to be done to just clear and remove this spirit. And in fact, in this particular case, she had got caught up with a cult over in Canada, and at some level, this spirit force had got latched into her. So, if you like, what appears sometimes on the surface is not necessarily what's going on underneath. So how can we begin to model these dynamics? Well, we need to think about spirit, soul, mind, and body. And one of the ways I want to do this is to look about something which I think is incredibly important, which is the dance that goes on between our inner world and outer world. So we can begin to look at this. Well, I think we would all agree that somewhere in the core part of our being, there's an inner spiritual self, soul, doesn't matter what term you call it. And also around us we have a form of ego, shell that we create. And into our outer world, we have a whole group of individuals and people. Now, what I don't think is so often appreciated is standing between what's going on inside and this outer world is that there is a whole group of what I've called inner archetypes or subpersonalities. And if we can highlight this here, one of the things in all of this is that people in our outer world, friends, family, associates, etc., reflect our inner world archetypes. So the outer world is reflecting the inner world. And in other words, the energy that comes through from your inner self connects in with the inner archetype and then gets reflected out into the outer world. So one way we can understand what's going on inside of us is just to simply look at what's happening in our outer world. If our outer world is all healthy and balanced, then the inner world is healthy and balanced. If the outer world is all chaotic or has problems, then there's something that's a real problem inside of ourselves. So just to highlight this a little bit more, people in our outer world, friends, family, associates, etc., reflect our inner world archetypes. And it's this inner world archetypes which I think is really fascinating and where some amazing senses of healing can take place. Now, what we need to appreciate is that these inner world archetypes start to get laid down in childhood. And this is why childhood is such an important and informative period in our lives. And if there's difficulties which go on in childhood, traumas occur in childhood, then it can start to affect the development of this inner world archetypal pattern. And we can pick up some of this. Oh, well, let's just first of all look at what is the dynamic which holds it all together. I would call it resonance. And I was talking with Professor Fred Alan Wolfe about all of this, who put me in line with the idea that everything is held together by resonance. If two things are resonating together, then there is a connection energetically. So, our outer world characters are resonating with what's going on inside of us. And it's this core essence is reflecting out, the energy from the core essence reflects out into our outer world archetypes, outer world people. Now, the other aspect of all of this is when you change what's going on inside, the outer world has to change as well, because the two are mirroring each other. And we can follow this through. Let's say here we are, our inner core self hits the inner world archetype and reflects out into this outer world. And let's say there's some dynamic here to do with jealousy, which is holding this pattern of energy together. But all being good New Agers or Aquarian Agers or whatever, you do a lot of work on yourself, begin to sort out the issues of jealousy. You begin to change this inner world archetypal form, and what happens is then the outer world, let's say you bring in the question of acceptance, then the outer world personality will change. They have to change if they're going to stay in resonance with you. If they choose not to stay, not to change, they try to hold the same pattern, there can be a tussle to begin with, but then the energy link will dissolve and they will simply go out of your life. That's the pattern of how it works. And that energy is still flowing with you, still needs to be connected, and so someone new will come into your life to match that quality. So, what we can say is, if there is a problem with your outer world, then it indicates a problem with one or other of your inner archetypes. And when a person is feeling they have a problem with spirit release type situations, you need to look at what's going on in these inner archetypes. And these inner world archetypes, I think, also relate to something that's referred to the alters of multiple personality disorder, because, again, you can begin to see the same patterns occurring. So let's quickly just pick up a few things to do with trauma. Here we are. We get a situation here where in the childhood we get some form of sexual abuse or some form of abuse. It creates a distortion in the whole of the inner world archetypal pattern. There's a breakdown of the ego boundaries, imbalances occur, and then what gets projected out onto the outer world can sometimes be pretty terrifying and horrific. So when trauma occurs, and it's not just in childhood, but it's the childhood times are very important, then the ego boundaries get broken down and the person is subject to invasion on all sorts of levels. And this can not only be spirits, but thoughts, energies, dynamics that are going on. We can pick up a few childhood problems, quickly run through them. Abuse, and that can be physical, sexual, emotional, psychological. Domineering or controlling parents, absent parents. All of these are important in the formation of the inner archetypes in childhood. Rivalries, jealousies, environmental problems, preschool years, schooling, bullying at schooling, and now perhaps more important than ever is the way that drugs sometimes upset the balance of what's going on in this development stage. Now, another little part here, we can get sometimes splits within the psyche, and this is effectively what was taking place in this case which I had to deal with. One of the things we need to understand about these inner world archetypes is they have a polarity balance to them. So we need to recognize the two sides of it. I can be good at something and not good at something. They can be masculine, feminine. They carry polarities through, and these polarities can sometimes get split. I sometimes say if I'm going to be in balance, I need to acknowledge both the Hitler and the Christ inside of me and find the balance between the two. Now, if the split, as occurred in this particular woman, becomes so painful, sometimes it gets ejected from the psyche and creates a form of possessing entity, which is what happened. This woman's murderous rage was so overwhelming that she split it off from herself. And in those cases, all of the trying to clear the spirit in the world will not get rid of it. You have to integrate it. Now I want to just see whether we can find the concept of inner archetypes. If my theory is right about inner archetypes being both what's inside of us and reflected out into the outer world, we should see some of these things mirrored in other forms of traditions and beliefs. And I think we can find them in quite a number. But let's just pick up one or two ancient models in all of this. The Bagua in China. This dates about over 4,000 years. And as you can see, the way they developed, if I can get the arrow, based upon a simple principle, yin and yang energies. And they then developed this into 8 primary archetypal forces. And the way in ancient China which they worked with all of this was either through feng shui or the I Ching. And in feng shui, they took a very simple concept by saying we're going to outline a room or a house, and we're going to set harmonious balance in our outside world to reflect these principles. If the outside world is balanced, so too is the inner side. It helps integrate and balance the inside. And they associated each of these archetypes with a different area, like wealth, fame, relationships, and so forth. And the I Ching is simply by taking a combination of any of the two of these characters. Chinese. Another one that I like a lot is the Egyptian. And again, we can put the 8 gods and goddesses, the Heliopolitan pantheon, into this. You see they sit very neatly in there. And you can say they represent principles which we can connect with. Now, if I see the divine form of that principle, it's accentuating or trying to balance the divine form inside of me. Tarot cards. See how diverse these things are. Any of you done the tarot cards will recognize that when you look at the major arcana, there are 8 key character cards. And we have them showing here. We've got the Fool, and we've got the Devil up here. Now we need to recognize the Devil in this particular form is part of those inner archetypes. I don't like the word devil, but it's the perhaps counselor is better, but it's the archetype which makes us look at and deal with and acknowledge some of the shadow aspects of ourselves. We have another tradition, the Kabbalah. Well, the Kabbalah is slightly different because they talk about 10 key archetypes in here. But if you actually look closely, what you find is that there's a group of 8. And we can see that highlighted there. There's also one in the middle. Well, this reflects out to our soul or spiritual self. And we have another at the bottom, which relates to our ego mind. Now, the slight difficulty about the Kabbalah is it tends to lock all of this into the situation that in order for me to get to there, I have to go through this particular archetype. And in fact, what is more relevant is that we connect in through different archetypes in relationship to all of this. But at the top of this particular tree, you would find, if we put tarot cards, you've got the Fool. So it's the same similar patterns which we're looking at. And even something in a more modern way, which I think is quite fun. Sudoku. Any of you into Sudoku? You find the same type of grid going on. And what I think is quite insightful about all of this is if we take this as representing one archetype, what you recognize is within one archetype, there's also representatives of all the other. It's the hologram effect. And this process goes on. And there's billions of permutations in Sudoku. So we have an endless variation. And we can overlay these different models onto all of this. And you can see the connection between the two. Now, a couple of other things which we ought to add into all of this, these things, is the environmental influences which can affect us, and we've talked about some of the childhood development. Another hugely important one is all to do with the ancestral. This is another stream of energy which comes down through to us. And I've done a lot of work myself in working with people through clearing some of the ancestral forces and patterns. But there's a little story which I think best emphasizes this, which comes out of a book called Healing the Family Tree by Dr. Kenneth McCall. And he talks about an individual who came to see him who had a terrible desire inside of her to want to gouge people's eyes out. Quite heavy sort of stuff, really. But when she started to research back into her family history, she found that one of her ancestors indeed was connected with a castle. And when they went to the castle, they found implements for gouging people's eyes out. And so they carried out a healing ceremony, so to speak, within the church context to release that ancestor. And as soon as that was done, the problem of this particular person dissipated. She no longer was suffering that trauma. And another area which we needed to put into the pot is everything to do with past lives, which we talked about in the last conference, in which Roger Walger picked up on. So what we can say is that we have this energy that comes through the inner self, which reflects out into the archetypal realm and picks up the qualities within the environment. So we need to think about all of these elements in the balancing and the healing of the individual. So what are the processes that we need to go through in looking at all of this? Well, first and foremost, if I was giving healing to someone who I'm trying to help someone with this, I come from a point of view of recognizing that in the core part of their being, there is a place which is completely balanced, whole, and perfect. If you like, it's the God bit inside of us. And one of my tasks is to try to help the person access their own inner divine whole part. Because if you can access that, it begins an incredibly powerful energy to help balance some of the other things that are going on. If I sense that there's a spirit which is latched onto the person, well, obviously that needs to be dealt with. So you would send healing to the spirit, try to communicate it. Why is it there? What way is it causing a problem for the person? Can it be integrated or not? And if necessary, you need to do work to release it. And you finally manage to get it to a point where it's separated, and then you can say, bye-bye. And then I would work extensively with trying to integrate the soul or the archetypal fragments. And I've done a lot of this work myself, and it doesn't matter which way you do it. I can work with the inner archetypes. I can try to communicate with them, connect with them. And there's a wonderful book which put me onto all of this called The Inner Guide Meditation. The Inner Guide Meditation by someone called Edwin Steinbrecher. And he talks about how in his journey he would learn to communicate with his inner tarot card archetypes. He worked with them, but it's the same principles. Or I can deal with it in the outer world. And I've done this a time. If I've got a problem with Joe Bloggs, it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with Joe Bloggs, it's a problem with the Joe Bloggs inside of me. So I will invite that person into my inner world, and then I will start to communicate with them, find out what it is that needs to go on to shift in order to free up the things. And if you get it to shift, then you will find a very, very speedy response coming out of all of this. It's also working with recognizing that these, just to emphasize here, if we get the inner archetype out of balance, which is causing a problem in the outside world, then it's what we need to do to heal this part in order for the person to be integrated. But when you heal that inner part, recognizing, as I said, that there's a polarity. So one of the techniques I used at one time was someone was causing me a whole lot of hassle. I got a piece of paper and wrote down all of the good things I could see in this person's nature. And within a couple of days, their whole attitude towards me changed. In other words, I started to integrate and balance those two sides of the polarity. So how can we summarize all of this? Well, what I would say is spirit release in people is much more complex than in places, perhaps much more fascinating and interesting, although both have their, value. I think we can model let's just go back on that. I think we can model what's going on by looking at a mixture of ancient concepts and modern knowledge. I think near-death experience work is fantastic in all of this, but recognizing how other traditions have understood these patterns. I think we need to take into account both ancestral as well as past life patterns, because there can be influences which come down from the past life, which come down through these impact on these inner archetypes and cause them patterns. Whereas spirit attachment occurs within people, work needs to be done to heal and balance the client's inner archetypes and strengthen their psyche. I think this is hugely important. And therefore I would say soul integration needs to be an integral part of spirit release. You cannot, there are occasions where perhaps something is impacting upon someone, you move it off, and they're fine. Something like the suicide cases I've mentioned. But in most of the cases I deal with, a lot more inner work needs to go on for the person to feel centered and balanced and free from all this. And I'd finally like to finish on this by just reminding everyone that we need to go through 2 initiatory journeys. So, the heroes amongst us, we need to go out and slay our dragons. And what do I mean by that? The dragons are your fears. And one of the biggest challenges in life is we have to confront our fears. We don't have to necessarily hit them head on. You can deal with them obliquely. After all, Perseus slew the Medusa by looking in his shield. But what you need to recognize is when you slay the fear, it transforms into something else. And the myth of Perseus from the Greek mythology beautifully describes this, because out of the body of Medusa sprang the white-winged horse Pegasus. And the heroines amongst us, they also have a very important task. They need to love their beasts. And I can assure you, sometimes loving the unlovable bits of us is the hardest task of all. Because we can look at parts of our own psyche and think, oh, it's disgusting, I don't want it, it's horrible. But you need to integrate it, love it, and transform it. And I think at that stage, we'll call an end to what I was going to say. So, thank you very much. Andrew wanted me to put this one back on again. We might have got time for 1 or 2 questions.
It's not quite the end, and that's just lovely, that slide. And I thought, David, you've very beautifully managed to, apart from covering an enormous amount of ground, to highlight that thing that is so important, to go into the soul essence and work from there with the help and the guidance of that part of one's being. It puts spirit release in a context rather than being a thing unto itself. And then, of course, the integration, the complexity of integration, and the marriage, if you like, of psychological process and spiritual process. We are human beings, we're not in spirit, we're down here, but we are of spirit. So thank you. Let's have 1 or 2 comments and questions. Lady down here, can we have the roving mic?
Have we got a roving mic?
It's a short question.
I'll repeat your question in the meantime. So if you can... Yeah.
I wonder if this kind of work can be done surrogately.
Lady wonders if this kind of work has been done surrogately.
You mean working it through another individual? Okay, from a healing perspective, one of the things which I will sometimes do is to communicate with the person's inner archetypes. So, yes, if you like, healing work can go on to help free and release stuff. But I'm very, very keen generally. After all, there's sometimes for people, you get maybe young children, or you would get people who are maybe have a difficult psychological process going on inside them, so you can't interact with them. So that's the only way to approach it. But generally, I like to really involve people in the process.
We found our microphones. Yes, this person. Oh, all right. We'll come to you next.
Could you give some example of how you help people to integrate the damaged archetype?
Okay, well, there's two ways. First of all, as I said, I would like to come, first of all, by getting them to get a sense of connecting into whatever they feel is really balanced and whole inside of them. And then there's 2 ways of actually approaching this. One is to deal with the situation is out there by simply saying, if they have a problem with such and such a person, what can we do to heal and balance this? And for them, sometimes even through psychodrama to work it out. So in that case, you don't have to worry too much about the archetype. You just deal with the situation, recognizing the situation reflects the archetype. Does that make sense? Or secondly, I will get them to work directly if I feel that there's a particular problem they have with one or other of these archetypes, to try to bring a form through for them to begin to connect to that. This sometimes works more easily on one's own journey. If we go back to the Bagwell, we have different directions, so forth. So I can say in the north I have a particular energy, in the south I have a particular energy. I can go into my mind and imagine I'm going on a journey, following that path through, and meeting a character which represents the archetype in my inner world. And to give you an example, when I first of all headed north to meet my devil, who should appear but Darth Vader? So you say, oh God, how am I going to deal with Darth Vader? You know, this is an inner world connection. And so in my mind, in that particular case, I felt I actually had to shrink him down. So I actually got him down to a nice small size and then stuck him in my pocket and continued on my journey. And there were various other processes which I went through. So you can begin to work creatively within the psyche to begin to understand these energies and how you can interact with them in that form. Does that sort of make sense?
Thank you. Over here. Do introduce yourself as well.
My name is Harry Underhill, and I sort of came into this healing thing, because I haven't been psychic, at least not yet, through the appalling suffering in the world and the people who seem to cause it, who I'm sure are suffering themselves.
Yes.
And the only way I could think of was appealing to their inner healer, because I don't know what's wrong with them. I don't want to get involved with them. But if everybody's got an inner healer, whether it's Bush or Blair or anybody else, can we send that inner healer energy and leave them to sort it out?
Absolutely. I think this is hugely important. After all, if we are going to send out lots of nasty thoughts to Bush and Blair, it's not going to help them find their own sense of balance and integration. It's just going to exaggerate the problems, any problems they might have. And that was the interesting thing, is that in all those peace marches, talking with some of the people who certainly weren't marching with peace in their hearts. They were furious, and a lot of them were really furious and angry. And that's the blind. You know, we need to acknowledge all of these bits that are going on inside of myself. I need to be able to stand in my angry bit, and I need to be able to stand in my peaceful bit. And then I can find a balance between the two. And if I can find the balance between the two, it's not a problem. But what you find is when you're dealing with individuals, is very often they will say, oh, I never get angry. You know, I'm very peaceful, I'm very calm. And then you find they're surrounded by furious people. It's quite simply that they're not acknowledging their own sense of anger. They sort of split it off. Well, they suppress it. And then when you suppress something, it comes out elsewhere. So this is the problem we have when we're sending out light and healing to the planet. If I'm only sending out light to the planet, what happens to all the shadow? What happens to all the nasty bits? You know, the only way to do this is to come from a point of view of balance, for me to be able to integrate these things inside of us and send out a thought of balance, recognizing that sometimes for things to be worked through, they need to be transformed. I sometimes feel and have thought that one of the reasons why war takes place, have you ever thought why men like fighting? I think at some deep psychological level, it's because we're trying to confront our fear of death. And what better way to confront your fear of death than to go and stand in there and fight? And maybe when we've really come to terms with our fear of death, the need to fight and so forth will become dissipated. You know, and it comes down to balance again. So beautifully expressed in the Chinese philosophy of yin and yang, the dance of opposites. And if I can integrate these things, then it ceases to become a problem. I'm not held by the energy.
Okay, time for the last question. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you. My name's Michael Case. I work as a healer and a healer teacher and as a medium. I have more of a comment to make. You set up a pattern of archetypes, and I was taught very early on by the first tutor I ever went to that the biggest journey I ever undertook was the journey within. And once I'd learnt to deal with that, then maybe I could help others. and that's something I continue to teach. Getting people to confront and face their fears, their dragons, their beasts, whatever, is a frightening experience for most people when they come into development circles and learn to do healing or just learn to develop themselves. Just getting them to take the first step starts a very great journey for everybody, including all of us here. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for sharing that. I would echo all of that. And we need to learn to trust. You know, the universe in a strange way is not out there to get us. It's generally all our own stuff which is causing the problem. And if we can recognize this, then there's a way of beginning to take it forward. But it's learning to be truly loving on oneself, to recognize that perhaps you don't have to take huge steps, just taking little steps is all that's needed so that you're moving forward. And in that way, then I think we can begin to find a real sense of integration. And when that happens, I mean, I've worked with individuals who, once they've integrated these qualities inside themselves, all of this outside world's feelings of being invaded or having problems getting at them or spirits latching onto them just dissipates. So I know from my own working experience that it's hugely important for this sense of the integration of those parts of themselves in order for the transformation to take place.
Well, thank you so much, David, for a tremendous talk, and may we all slay our dragons and learn to love our beasts and help each other to do so. Thank you very much indeed. We have a good lunch break until 2:30. It's long enough to go out and enjoy the summer day. But please be back here for a prompt start at 2:30. As I mentioned before, there is a refectory if you want to eat in Regent's College itself.
Can I just say
The
something?
refectory is on the ground floor. It's signposted from reception. If you go back to reception.
Andrew, can I just say something before everybody leaves?
Yeah, can you hang on a moment?
The Spirit Leads Foundation are hoping to set up local groups close to yourselves. If anybody would like to talk more about that, you can see me during the lunch break, and I'll be glad to talk to you about it.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, David. Lovely. Very good.
I got into this sort of thing at the very fringe through something called a Churches Fellowship for
Oh, yes.
Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Yeah.
Because I was a bit scared of voodoo, so I thought I'd start from the church.
Yeah.
And of course, you go actually a bit broader than that.
Indeed, yeah.
Have you come across them, though?
I've heard of the Church's Fellowship of Spiritual and Psychic Studies. Yeah. I think it's it's a step, isn't it? And like a lot of these organisations, they need to start to begin to understand and open up to these things.
And a number of dioceses have
Yes.
what you call exorcists.
They do, yeah.
People, and they can give us some of what you've already given us.
Yes.
But without necessarily having to say the creed and go to Eucharist. Because I'm a Quaker, so
Yes,
I
you don't
don't
like doing
get
that.
into that.
Yeah. No, well, that's I think this idea of these knowledges is coming forward in a much wider level now. So it's great, whichever way it comes out.
But whatever religious belief people have, I imagine if you can dig deep enough, they have the same wisdom.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Oh, yes.
Including the Muslims, of course. Thank you.
Yes. That's great. Hi.
I'm Rebecca. My name's Rebecca.
Yes, hi, Rebecca.
Yeah. I really enjoyed your talk, but I found it too much information, and I wanted to do any handouts.
Yes, what I've got is well, one is that all of these will be available.
When I was writing, then I was missing stuff.
Yeah. I've got handout sheets which are available for sale over in the reception area. So if you want to get one of those, and then hopefully also we're going to have the DVDs of everything can be for sale.
Oh, brilliant. So they're going to record it?
It's all been recorded, yes.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
You don't get that for free then?
It will, well, obviously there's the cost of production of it all, so.
Yeah.
so
No, it's really good to just be reiterated what I've got from Tony Meeks, of course, a long time, 5 years
Yes.
ago. Balance. I mean, more than that, but that's what I
yeah.
set up. But I think I would like to see for an evening.
Okay, well, that would be fine. Again, if you go over into the Herringham Hall, which is where all the teas and coffees are, there's leaflets there and information there on all of that, and then we can organise something.
Cool, yeah, no, definitely. I'm not sure what I'd like to study it, but yeah. I'd like to do something.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know, sort of thought about it.
Yes. Well, it's the number of sort of different types of courses and workshops which we're doing. So perhaps the introductory course or something like that would be helpful.
Which one?
Well, it's the introductory course from the Spirit Relief Foundation. So there's one which we have